All right, welcome back to the Introduction to Web Dev series. This is quiz number 2B, and so let's just get right into the rest of the questions. So this first one we have here is, how would I create a new paragraph and add it to a div with ID 1? And for this one, I'm not going to read out the options. You can sort of read them, and I'll give you some time to think about them. And yep, the answer is A. So for this question, you kind of just need to know some syntax, and you need to know the name of some methods. So A is correct. Let's go over the rest of them and why that isn't correct. This first line of code, it says let p equals document.newElement. Our good friend, the MDN web docs, love those guys. When you want to make a new element, what you have to type out is create element. It is not new element. So B doesn't work for that reason. Let's look at C. So we've got let p equals document.createElement p. That looks good so far. Then the next line, we've got our tricky little hashtag again. Remember that ID, which is short for if document.getElement by ID. Get element by ID. It accepts just the name of the ID. You don't need the hashtag because it's sort of implied because you are getting the element with that ID. So this one doesn't work either. And lastly, we've got D. So we've got let p equals document.createElement p. That looks good so far. Then we've got ID1. Okay, good. We're only passing in the name, no hashtag. But then we've got add child. Add child, unfortunately, according to the MDN web docs, is incorrect. It's append child. So this one does not work either. And for that reason, the correct answer is A. Let p equals document.createElement p. ID1.append child p. So what you're doing is you're creating this new variable that's a paragraph. And then you're adding that newly created paragraph to that div with ID 1. Awesome. Let's move on to the next question. True or false? If the function associated with your event listener is anonymous, you can remove the event listener. A, true. B, false. The answer is B. You cannot remove this event listener. The reason why, of course, we're going to turn to our MDN web docs. They've got the good stuff there. So the syntax for it is remove event listener type, where type is, the type of event that you want to remove it for. So for example, let's say there's some sort of click event that you wanted to remove from some element. You need to pass in the type event, and then you also need to pass in the listener. So the listener can be, if you have some sort of function on click where you define it, blah, 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 what you would do is you would pass that on click. But, in the event of an anonymous function, anonymous functions famously do not have names. So you wouldn't actually have anything that you would be able to pass into here. So for that reason, if you're ever going to be removing an event listener, you probably don't want to add it with an anonymous function. You want to define a function, name it, and then pass it in to add event listener. And then let's say, for example, you wanted to, get rid of that event listener later on. You can use that. Event listener function later on. All right, next question. What is the value of this in these lines of code? And we're grabbing the ID, we're grabbing the element with the ID button 2, we're adding this event listener, click, and then we've got this function where we're console.logging the value of this. So what is the value of this? A, the global window object, B, the element with ID button 2, or C, the event listener? Here, the answer is B. And the reason why has to do kind of with scope. So in this, let's see, what color do we want to do? Let's do green. In this scope out here, let's say that we I don't know, we defined some random variable, random equals blah. In this scope out here, if you were to use this would refer to our global window object. And this window object exists. You can, calculate the height and width of it. There are different properties, different functions you can call on it. And it's just kind of like a given when you're running your JavaScript in the browser. But when you have a callback, right? So this is our callback function. The scope of this, where this is, where this is this, it's a little bit confusing. I don't know why they called it that, but it makes learning and teaching this a bit difficult. But the scope of this becomes smaller. It's no longer the global window object. What it is what we added the event listener on. So the value of this would now be that element, right? So if the value that we would print out would be something like button ID equals button 2, I don't know, probably self-closing. This is what we would print out. We print out this equals that. So this is something kind of important, kind of interesting to consider. And like, maybe you're thinking, why did they do this? Well, it's actually pretty useful. So because this now points to this element, what we can do is we can manipulate it. So let's say, for example, that the text content of this button, let's say we had some button and it said like, hello, click me. And we wanted to change it. Oh, that doesn't really look like it says click. Hello, click me. And we want it to switch to say like, you clicked me when you click on it. We can use this for that. It's pretty exciting, isn't it? We can say, if we put it inside the callback function, we can say this dot text content equals, erase this, you clicked me. And since, as I keep saying over and over again, this refers to the button, what that's going to do is it's going to change this value here, this text content. And it's going to say, you clicked me, if you click on it. So this can be pretty powerful, but just remember, you need to be aware of the scope of this. So next question, very similar, but slightly different. What is the value of this in these lines of code? So we're grabbing the element with ID button 3, we're adding an event listener, a click listener, and we've got this anonymous callback, and we want to print out the value of this. What is the value of this? The value of this in this scenario is actually the global window object. I know you're very tempted, oh, we got a bit of a typo there. I know you're very tempted to say B, but it is not B. And the reason why is because we used an anonymous function here. So with anonymous functions, they don't capture that scope anymore. So before, when we had this green scope and then we had the orange scope of the callback, there's no longer the orange scope. So it's all global. This refers to the global window object because there's no scope. We didn't create a scope. So for that reason, here's another example. So if you were to define this anonymous function and set it into this variable get_context, and you print it out console log this equals window, is going to be true. And the reason why is there isn't that outer scope. It's all inside of the global. It's all inside of the global this scope. And then let's say you return this and then you called it. This would equal window would be true. And it has to do with that scope. And this is just something tricky that you kind of have to remember. All right, next question. If I have a function that's 3+ lines of code, it should be A, an anonymous function, or B, a named function. The correct answer is B. So this question, I don't know, this can be your style choices, but in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, once you have a function that's 3+ lines of code, it should no longer be anonymous. And the reason why is anonymous functions are sort of, less intelligent functions. They're ones that you wouldn't anticipate having to call over and over again. They're kind of like one-offs. And name functions are important not only because when you're naming a function, you're giving it context, but also you might be calling that function more than once, right? So here's an example. I've got this quadratic formula function, and what you see is it spits out, the first and second roots of the quadratic equation, and it's doing quite a lot of stuff, right? You could even split up these two into more than one line of code, but it's really important that we name this because it's quadratic. Even with the name, like if this was a anonymous function, I'd be like, okay, so we're given three parameters, it's doing a lot of complicated math, and then it's returning two values. I mean, I guess, but once you get that name in there, suddenly I'm like, oh, it returns, it has to do something with the quadratic formula, and I can probably make that jump that it's returning the roots. Versus we've got this anonymous function. Notice it doesn't have a name. If I were to name it, I'd probably name it something like add, but this is an anonymous function. We're getting rid of that. We're not saying it has a name. It's doing something pretty simple. It doesn't need that name, right? And you might be wondering, hey, but it is named. Well, not exactly. So the function itself is anonymous, but we're just storing it inside of a variable. And then we're using it on the next line. But we didn't bother to name the function because it wasn't worth doing it. It was pretty simple. You can tell right away what it's doing. It doesn't need that sort of self label, right? And that about wraps up the introduction to web dev quiz number 2. If you have any questions, feel free to comment. And yeah, have a good rest of your day.